When it comes to motion blur with pyro explosions, I find that it's probably easiest in this situation to just keyframe every single frame involved with the camera shake. Now, you could try to track the footage and take that animation if you wanted to. You could try to add a noise and chops, but I don't think the noise and chops actually does a very good job at describing what a camera shake would do. So, because there's not many frames involved, we can just go frame by frame and set our own keyframes for this. So here we have an explosion. It lands, and there we go. There's the camera shake. So, going frame by frame, we're going to start heading down in the bottom right. So notice how we can actually have these little arcs from our motion blur. So that kind of tells you the direction that we're heading here. Okay, in our scene, I have two windows right here so that I can see what's happening. The key to getting this believable is to look at the shockwave from up here. Get a bird's eye view of what that shockwave is doing and try to imagine how long it would take for that to reach the camera. In this case, I'm going to say maybe around frame 75 or 6. That's when we start seeing the motion blur take place. On our camera, let's keyframe the rotate and the translate. And the first frame right here will just be the normal values that we have. But then after that, so starting on, let's say, frame 78, we're going to get that downward motion. And it's pretty drastic. So we're going to go pretty heavy right about there on that motion. Again, if we look at our camera on the reference, we took our explosion from right about here to right about up there. So that's a fair bit of distance going along there. So again, that's from maybe right about there to right about here. Keyframe that. And after that, go forward some more frames. Looks like the next motion is going to be up. So again, follow those motion trails. We're then going to swing upwards like this. And don't forget to go to frame 79, by the way. So we swing upwards, maybe right around there. And once we do that, we can then go back down. It's kind of a back and forth thing. So frame 80, go back down, right around there. And then after we go down, it kind of normalizes a little bit. So we can then go down a bit more even right here and get that all keyframed on frame 81. So go down a bit more. And it looks like to finish off the motion blur, it just kind of rattles around for the next few frames. So it just kind of goes up and down a slight bit. So going up, and it's just kind of tiny movements from there. So what I'll do at this point is I'll go back to the values I had originally. So copy the parameter, and on frame 82, I'm going to paste the values here to get us back to where we were before. So right now, if we play this, we have a camera shake that does this kind of thing. And the other thing we'll have to do to make this really believable is we'll need to add a little bit of defocusing as well. So, but before we get there, to get the last little movements believable, we go from frame 81, snap back to 82, and then everything is basically going to revolve around frame 82 to get us back in frame. So from here, it looks like in our previous frame, we went up. So now on the next frame, I'm going to go down, something like this. And with each keyframe, I'm going to get less and less intense on my movements. So we go maybe right about there, keyframe that, keyframe that, and then at frame 87, we paste the values again. So once we do that, let's go ahead and do a play blast showing the large plume as well. And let's see what happens when we end up with that. It looks like we need to change the timing on that. Obviously, the cache is switching out to an old thing I was doing, so we'll fix that in the future as well. But that aside, it's looking a little bit too intense right now. If we compare that motion blur, and it, this is hard to tell without the actual blur in it. But if we take a look at that camera shake, it just feels a little bit less intense in the reference. So I think I went a little bit too drastic with the movements when I was keyframing this. So especially at the first keyframe, that was just a little bit too intense. But in general, this is going in the right direction. So let's try this. Shift left mouse, highlight everything. I want everything to happen sooner. And then what I'll do is go frame by frame again and make the movements less drastic. So if we go back to our two planes side by side, we get out of here and we go again frame by frame here. So for frame 69, that's the main one that's a little bit too intense. So I'm taking a look at where my little gnomon guy is going. We're not going to go all the way down there. We'll go maybe somewhere around here. So that means we go from there to there. And that's going to be less intense. That's also a little bit too crazy, so we'll bring that in. Go a little bit less crazy there. And then I did like, for the most part, the finishing frames. Just the little movements along here. These weren't so bad. So with that now being the case, what does that do? All right, I like the timing. I think that the timing is better on this, but I also think that we are getting rid of our shake too soon. So see at the very end, it just snaps right back into place. It just doesn't feel very natural with how big those movements are. So let's add a few more keyframes at the end of this and make just really tiny movements to try to taper that down a bit. If we take a look again at our reference, it looks like we have one big movement and then all the other movements after that are pretty tiny. So I think that we also need to adjust some of the camera shake on the later frames. So I think after the first two frames, what we'll do is we'll have our main large shake happen for the first couple of frames, right? So let's go back to auto update. Let's go ahead and copy the keyframes again over here. So copy parameter. Again, we go down pretty drastically, and then we go up drastically. But then I feel like we need to get ourselves back to where we were before. So paste the values, getting back to 71. And after doing that, we have success. I think that looks pretty darn good. One last thing to do on this is to keyframe the focus distance. So right now our focus distance is way out here. If we go to our, I believe it's view, we have an area on here, or actually I think it's, looks like sampling. Yeah, the focus distance right here. Let's go ahead and keyframe that, set it to our main area of the explosion. Once things start shaking, we're going to keyframe our focus back like this. I mean, imagine the shockwave pushing the lens backwards if it's a zoom lens or something like that. Sometimes you will see this defocus happening, and well, that's a really cool thing to emulate. Now, the thing about the defocus is that it takes a quick second after the camera shake has stopped to refocus in typically. So I'll keyframe that back along here. Let's take a look at our tangents real fast for that. So we'll focus on the focus distance. There we go. And we don't need an ease in, so let's just go like that. And I think that will work just fine. So again, it will just gradually focus back over time like that. And we can push this keyframe maybe a tad bit further back like that. But that will be a cool effect in combination with the camera jittering. And just to see what this looks like when it's rendered, here is a few frames of that motion blur rendered out in Redshift with just the terrain. So it's a little bit jarring to watch. I'll go ahead and pause it. But I think that looks pretty darn good. It's very similar to what we saw in the reference. So that about does it for the motion blur in general. Let's go ahead and run one more test on, I believe it's frame 71 or wherever this is at, on the pyro, just to make sure that the pyro plume is doing the same kind of motion blur with the camera. And then once we have that, we'll be good to go. So yeah, on Karma, motion blur does not work by default. And that is because when we're trying to feed Karma USD information, it needs to have information from the previous frame and the frame ahead of it. So we actually have something called a cache lop, which will do exactly that. If we change this cache behavior to cache rolling window of frames, that's going to bring in frames that happen before the current frame and after the current frame, which allows it to have all the info it needs to draw out that deformation motion blur. So on the before, after, and increments, all we need to say is that the number of frames to think about before the current frame is 1. It's going to think about 1 frame after the current frame, and then we are going by increments of 1 frame. So you set it like this, and now when we restart Karma, we could see that we now have this blurring out as it should. Now, right now the shader's all off because we're seeing an old cache, so don't worry about that. But now we do have the motion blur working, and I'd also recommend keyframing the pixel samples a bit higher during this particular section. Whenever you have large areas of motion blur, you'll want to up these pixel samples right here because that's the main thing which gets rid of that motion blur grain. So let's go ahead and set this to manual real fast. I believe this all starts around frame 68. So I'm going to keyframe our pixel samples here from 12 to, let's say, 32 or, I don't know, 48, something really high. The frame before that can be 12. And then this only lasts for a short little while. So anyway, you guys don't have to watch me manually keyframe this, but I think you get the idea now. That now takes care of the camera shake, leaving us with addressing how to go about multiple explosions being layered on top of one another. And I also forgot to mention this, but to composite this explosion properly, we also need a shadow catcher, or something that we can do to add in the shadow of the plume along the terrain. So let's talk about this shadow catcher in the next video, and then the last item will be addressing multiple explosions.